Hello and welcome everybody to the Inspire Education Summit. Welcome this evening. It's our second session of the week. I'm Alex O'Neill. I'm the host of the Limitless podcast, and I will be your host for every session throughout the summit this week. This event has been brought to you by myself and Joe Symes at Progressive Education, because a few years ago, we did some live podcast recordings in the Progressive Education Facebook group and realised that neither of us could sit by and watch the young people, the teachers, the leaders, the families be damaged by the education system anymore as it currently stands. We want to inspire everyone and anyone who will listen to take action from where they are, wherever you are, and imagine something different. For anyone who came along earlier today at 12 o'clock GMT, I hope you got as much out of the talk by the amazing Andrew Spate as I did. He was a bit of a last minute addition, as sadly our other guest Yumna couldn't join us today, but he was a fantastic inspiration for the opening of the summit, talking about his experience at school and his work now to support schools to bring more mental well-being, mental health well-being to their learners. For those that couldn't make it, don't worry, you can catch up on any missed sessions. We'll be sending out all the recordings after the session. And we want you to spread this far and wide. We want this message to be out there. We want everyone to be inspired. For Joe and I, this summit was born out of a desire to share an optimistic future for what a change in education could look like, as well as the lineup of 24 speakers over this week and next Monday. We're also celebrating the launch of an exciting new membership community for education startups. So people who want to start up their own schools or learning communities and do things a little differently. You will find out loads more about this next Monday when we launch, the 25th of November. We are launching our evening session, so 7:30 p.m. GMT, which will be our final summit session. So come along if you can, and if you can't make it, you'll find out more in your emails next week. One of the things that I found over the years of working with those that are creating change in the education space is I've experienced this constant reevaluation of who I am as a parent. I have a daughter, and the more I understand about how young people develop, learn, and behave, and what behaviour looks like for them and what it means, and what the research shows us about rewards and punishments used heavily in education spaces and home settings, the more I have to look at how I am with my daughter and what I need to change. It has been such an enlightening journey for me and my family, still ongoing, obviously, every day. And so I'm really, really pleased today to have, or this evening, to have a speaker with us who has developed a radical change in her parenting style and educational outlook, which she now shares with others across the world. Iris Chen is with us this evening. She's an unschooling mother, certified parenting coach, and founder of the Untigering movement. When her authoritarian attempts to raise obedient and high-achieving children only led to years of tears, tantrums, and conflict, she knew something had to change, and it wasn't her children. Iris, through her writing and speaking, she now shares her healing journey of shifting from power over to power with in her relationship with her children. Her mission is to inspire generational and cultural transformation through conscious parenting, self-directed learning, and decolonisation, especially among Asian communities. She is the author of a book, Untigering, which is called Untigering, Peaceful Parenting for the Deconstructing Tiger Parent, and she writes on her blog at untigering.com. So without further ado, I would love to welcome Iris to the screen. So please feel free to show yourself, Iris, and share your screen, and can't wait to hear your talk.
Thank you. Yes, let me share my screen if I can figure out how to do that. Okay, there we go. Is that showing up for everyone okay?
Yep, fantastic.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, welcome everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your evening. Most of you are in the UK, I'm assuming, to join us today. The title of my talk is From Tiger Mom to Unschooler, Decolonizing Education Through Self-Directed Learning. So before get into all the stuff about decolonizing education, I really wanted to start at the beginning of my story because before I was able to embrace self-directed learning as an unschooler, I was a tiger mom. I was a mom who was very strict and demanding. I had high expectations of my children to behave well and achieve academic success. And before I was a tiger mom, I was a tiger cub raised by tiger parents. And so I wanted to bring you along on my journey. My parents were first generation Chinese immigrants from Hong Kong and Vietnam. And they came over to the States when my older sister was just a baby, for my dad to study his master's and PhD. And this was a time in the US when they were welcoming scholars and intellectuals from all over Asia. And so education really became my father's path to success and opportunity. For my mom, she grew up in Vietnam and her father passed away when she was just a teenager. And as the oldest daughter of the family, she had to drop out of school to work so that she could support her younger siblings' education. But she had such a love of learning that she found a way to attend night school after a long day of work and eventually went to Hong Kong for college, where she graduated as valedictorian of her class. So, both culturally and within my own family, a formal education, getting good grades, doing well in school was all highly valued and an unspoken assumption. For me as a child, I'm the little girl with the bow in her hair there. I was a bright and precocious child. I enjoyed receiving the attention and affirmation for being smart. I did well in school. I graduated at the top of my high school class. I went on to go to a good university and finished in less than 4 years, after which I got a job as an editor in a startup company. And then I got married to a Silicon Valley engineer. And all of this was leading up to like being well on our way to achieving the American dream. So in many ways, tiger parenting and school worked on me and worked on my husband. After a few years of marriage, we were, wanting a bit of adventure. And so, even though both sets of our parents had immigrated from Asia to the United States, we reversed the migration pattern and we moved to China to be English teachers there. We thought we would stay for 1 year, and we ended up staying for 16. We started having children when we were in China. Both my sons were born in China. And when I became a parent, that was when my tiger mother instincts really kicked in. This was my tiger mom era. And the plan was for me to raise my two boys to be obedient, smart, and successful, just like I had been. So we started training them early. As a toddler, my oldest could recite his times tables in Mandarin. And age 4, I taught both my boys how to read. And around that same time, also, I enrolled them into piano lessons, of course. So on the slide, you can see my younger son showing off his penmanship. This was probably when he was around age 5, but it's pretty neat handwriting. So when it was time for them to go to school, we enrolled them in a private bilingual school. So hopefully they could be fluent in both Chinese and English. I taught there as a teacher, and then I also homeschooled them on the side so that we could keep up with the Western curriculum. So here is the part in many people's shift toward more progressive education, where they may face a school crisis of some kind. Maybe their child experiences school refusal or being bullied. Um, Maybe their child received a diagnosis of neurodivergence or a learning disability. They may start feeling very anxious when they think about school or start acting out in the classroom. And all of those are often the reasons why people start exploring options outside of the school system. And honestly, that was not our experience. Both my sons enjoyed school, did well in school. But what was happening was that I was going through some personal transformation. I was untigering. And just like Alex shared in the beginning of like the internal work that we have to do as parents, that was what was happening with me. My relationship with my oldest son had become increasingly fraught over the years. Growing up, he was a very sensitive child, but he would have a lot of meltdowns and tantrums and would act out. And as a tiger parent, the only thing I knew how to do was to control. And so the more he disobeyed, the harsher I punished, and the more he pushed, the harder I pulled. So it just, there was so much conflict. We were always at odds with each other. And things finally began to shift when I had a light bulb moment at a parenting workshop, where I learned about how our parenting actually affects our child's neurobiology. And the presenter showed brain scans of children's brains. One of a child who was neglected and harshly parented, and one of a child who wasn't. And how the survival parts of their brain of a harshly parented child would perceive threat and danger, and those parts of their brain were more developed and reactive, while the rational logical parts of their brain, like the prefrontal cortex, those parts of the brains were less developed and had less brain matter. And so it was in that moment that I realized how my coercive and punitive parenting was really stimulating those survival parts of my son's brain and causing him to scream and yell and throw things and just be dysregulated. And that whole time, I had been really punishing him and judging him for acting up when he needed my help to calm him down. He was having a hard time, not giving me a hard time. And with that perspective shift, that really put me on the path to learning more about conscious, peaceful parenting. It really helped me to recognize the humanity and dignity of my children. They weren't just like objects for me to mold and control, but they were sovereign human beings with their own experiences and their own wisdom. And so I really began to question and confront how I was using power over my children, and began to see, like, socially in our societies and in our world, how power is so often used over children in oppressive ways. Specifically with schooling, where our children spend so much of their childhood. The more I examined different educational models, the more I saw just how unjust and dehumanizing they were towards children. When we take a hard look at compulsory education, and for me, I can only speak from my context of having lived in China and North America, so I can't speak to what it's like maybe in your context. But what I see is like we have to be really honest about how the school system has been and continues to be a colonizing force. I see the colonizing impulse as one of subjugating a people and a land that is not yours. So it assumes one's own supremacy over others and denies their right to self-sovereignty and indigeneity. So we see this in forced assimilation of Native children in North America, where they were removed from their families and cultures and communities and placed in residential schools in order to train them to become more like those of European descent. And this hasn't just happened historically, but even in our current system, there is often a very xenophobic, ethnocentric, and a suppressive attitude towards different cultural identities. I know for me growing up, I grew up speaking Cantonese in my home, and that was my first language. But once I went to school, I quickly lost fluency. I forgot my mother tongue. Implicitly and explicitly, I internalized the belief that my Chinese identity, my language, my traditions were not as valuable as quote unquote American culture. And colonization does not just occur in terms of ethnic and cultural identity either. Maybe we wouldn't use the word colonization, but there's still this power over type of dynamic going on whenever power is used to enforce and propagate certain social norms and narratives and beliefs. So when I was living in China, school children were encouraged to join the Young Pioneers, which is the youth branch of the Communist Party. And those who were selected to join the Young Pioneers, they would get to wear a red scarf around their necks, and they received special recognition and privileges. And it was considered a great honor to be a young pioneer. But in my perspective, I just see that as another way in which power and social currency is used to control, to incentivize, to propagandize the youth. And this does not just happen in systems and institutions of education. Even in homeschooling, homeschooling can also be very colonizing when parents are actually thought policing their children, when they're limiting access to a variety of perspectives, when they are maintaining a dominant supremacist narrative that supports their own beliefs, and discouraging their child to think for themselves. So these are all ways that education can be a tool that is used to colonize. I also see the education as something that is very conformist, where it takes a one size fits all cookie cutter approach to education. And this is a model that comes out of like industrial mass schooling, factory schooling type of model that churns out products, but doesn't leave a lot of room for individuality or flexibility. This rigid system teaches that there is one right answer. So learners are often discouraged from asking questions, thinking outside the box, embracing nuance, exploring non-binary, non-black and white ideas. Instead, there's a lot of pressure to and need to be correct, instead of being open to dialogue and other perspectives. Children are often expected to meet certain arbitrary standards at a certain age. At this certain grade, these are the standards that you must meet. You must be able to complete these skills or have these skills at, grade 10 or whatever it is. They must follow a set curriculum. And to make sure that children comply and fall in line, there are usually a lot of rules, regulations, rewards, and punishments. We can reflect back on our school experience and think about behavior charts and dress codes and detention, point systems, attendance awards, grades. All of those are ways to impose conformity on children. I once observed a kindergarten class lining up to go to lunch, and there was one child who was really like antsy and squirmy, and he couldn't stand still. And the teacher yelled at him and sent him to the back of the line. And that just saddened me so much to see how the teacher expected this child to behave like a little soldier instead of like an actual 5-year-old boy. And so just so often, um, yeah, the school system just expects falling in line, conformity. Children are not allowed to question authority or call out injustice, especially not against adults. Like you can't talk back to the teacher, you can't question, a lot of the authority figures in the school system. Instead, they are really conditioned to stay silent and compliant. So coercive schooling, whether in an institution or at home, this can also happen within the home setting. This can create great minions and conformists, but not great leaders or disruptors. Compulsory education, I also think, is very capitalistic. There's this sense of like market competition and scarcity where students are like fighting it out for the best grades, for the awards, for the class rankings, the college admissions. Uh, I don't know, especially in the US, that's the sense that I get. There is also a privatization or a sense of ownership of knowledge where we hoard it for ourselves. We can't share our knowledge. There isn't this sense of collaboration or seeing knowledge as something to be shared and as open source. The focus of education is often on preparing children to enter into the capitalistic market system, where from a young age, children are asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? What college do you want to go to? What do you want to study? So all the ways that they are trained to think about education ties their identity and their worth to their careers, to how they're going to make money, to their status, all of that, rather than who they are as people, the content of their character, just their whole lives. And learning is rarely simply for the sake of learning. It's for the sake of what will look good on your resume or your college application. If we peel back the curtain a little bit and consider school funding or how teachers get their bonuses, that is also often driven by market objectives, right? By getting more funding. And it's based on student enrollment, attendance, performance, test scores, things like that. And so schools are incentivized to get more students, to mandate attendance, to focus on test scores rather than considering the health, well-being, and learning objectives of each child. The goal is often just to gain more funding. So what is the answer? I was given this prompt for this talk. I think each speaker was given this prompt, and it says, if you could design a new paradigm of education, how would it look? And on the one hand, I want to challenge the premise of this question because I feel like if I was to design a paradigm of education as a general model for others to use, that can be seen as colonizing and conformist because I am deciding and designing for you what I think is best. I am assuming that this one way of doing things is correct and can be applied to anyone. And just as was mentioned in the beginning, yeah, we need more options. We need a lot of flexibility. So on the one hand, I'm pushing back against this question. And on the other hand, I do think that there is a framework and a paradigm, a way to think about education that can help us decolonize our ideas and practices around education. For me, that paradigm is self-directed education. The Alliance for Self-Directed Education defines SDE. I'm just going to say SDE from now on, so I don't have to say that whole mouthful. But it defines SDE as education that derives from the self-chosen activities and life experiences of the learner, whether or not those activities were chosen deliberately for the purpose of education. So it really centers the learner's experience and initiative rather than having a top-down power over paradigm. Another term that I often use is unschooling. And unschooling expands beyond just education and describes a whole radical way of interacting with children. So Akilah S. Richards, who writes and speaks extensively on unschooling, defines it as a child-trusting, anti-oppression, liberatory, love-centered approach to parenting and caregiving. So if we look at these two definitions, SDE and unschooling are not what models of education, like what to read, what to learn, what to do with your child. It's not really that. They are who models, meaning it centers the learner themselves. And they are how models, where we want to trust children. We are anti-oppression. We are liberatory. We center love. So how can we begin decolonizing education and practicing this anti-oppression through SDE? Well, as unschoolers, we really see children as having autonomy, agency, and personal sovereignty. So we resist that colonizing impulse, the assumption of adult supremacy over children, and we really challenge and resist the belief that we have the right to impose our agenda onto them. When we think of a lot of educational models, it's like the adults making all the decisions. It's the adults deciding what they should study, what the curriculum should be, how it should be done, how they can absorb the information more. And this is really flipping that upside down and decolonizing our power over impulse over children. Because we respect our child's autonomy, learning is non-coercive and consent-based. Again, when we think about so many educational models, consent is not even discussed. It's just like, of course, children need to learn, and this is the way they should learn it. But when we want to begin decolonizing our education, non-coercion and consent definitely need to be part of that discussion, where education, learning is not implemented using power and control, where we get to decide what the child learns, when they learn it, how they learn it, et cetera, et cetera. Instead, unschooling is really rooted in the learner's intrinsic drive rather than something that's enforced from the outside. So again, it's a child trusting paradigm where you trust in the learner's innate drive to be curious and try to, like, that they inherently want to understand the world and engage with the world. And so it's not something that needs to be forced onto them, but something that you nourish and trust in them. SDE also does not require assimilation into the dominant culture. So, of course, if you live in a white dominant culture, there will always be social pressure to acculturate into that whiteness. But when we divest in some ways from these systems and these institutions that normalize assimilation, then we are more free to be connected to our cultural communities and identities and practices without shame. So there is a lot more freedom to explore and express who we are. In the States, there continue to be efforts to whitewash and erase history by banning books, curriculum, and narratives. And so this unschooling way, self-directed learning, is really a way to push back against that, to reclaim our power to have access to differing voices, a variety of voices, because we are not beholden to the state and their standards and their rules and their funding. We are more free and hopefully really encouraged to read widely, to question the dominant narratives that we are fed, and to listen specifically to marginalized voices. In contrast to a conformist, coercive school system, SDE can really be a practice where we get to be authentically ourselves. Where the child is not expected to conform and comply to any sort of arbitrary standard by adults or by the state. If they choose to comply with those standards, that is their own decision. And as parents and caregivers, we support them in doing that. But that is not something that is required of them. When we think about these extrinsic standards, oftentimes they do not take into consideration the fact that each child is unique, that they learn at their own pace, that they have different interests, different goals. They may be experiencing trauma, they may have a disability. So a conformist education really flattens a child's complex identity and dehumanizes them, whereas an SDE approach really is more holistic and honors the humanity and individuality of each child. So they're really encouraged to live life and pursue learning in a way that is aligned and consistent with who they are and what they want, where they're given the time and the space and the freedom to really know and be their authentic selves rather than feeling like they have to disconnect from themselves in order to please others. For my oldest son, who is now 16, he goes to a self-directed learning center 2 days a week. He's taking some classes at the community college. He's taking art history and English. Previously, he had also taken Chinese and color and composition. He has a part-time job. He spends a lot of time at home as well. He loves drawing digital art, playing video games, reading, playing guitar, chatting online with friends. So these are all chosen activities that are meaningful to him. But you can survey 100 different unschoolers and get 100 different lifestyles and educational paths because they are really free to tailor their life and learning to their particular interests and desires. So that's part of the beauty of SDE, is each person's freedom to be authentically themselves. Because unschooling is rooted in what Akilah Richards calls trust, anti-oppression, liberation, love, unschooling youth are not accustomed to fear-based behavior management or control. And because they know they deserve the right to respect and dignity and autonomy, they are often able to advocate for themselves and others. They aren't conditioned and trained to stay silent and to keep their head down. When we reflect on how maybe as adults who have gone through the school system as I have, When we reflect on how we've been affected by schooling, many aspects of our school experience are things that we now need to heal from as adults, if we think about it. Things like people pleasing, disembodiment, perfectionism, dualistic thinking, lack of bodily autonomy, hyper competitiveness. All of these things um, are part of school culture, and yet things that we know do not serve us in the long run. What if our children didn't have to grow up in a world where they were resigned to that type of reality, where that was their life? What if they had the freedom to grow up authentically themselves and whole and healthy? Well, self-directed education can be a practice where we really center our collective well-being and liberation. So the goal is not to become cogs in the capitalistic machine, but really to learn how to be fully human. And with unschooling, the child is seen as a whole person with whole human needs, where there's the need for sleep and rest, where there's a need for movement, the ability to eat and go to the bathroom when they need to, um, the need for communication skills and empathy and the ability to deal with conflict, all of that. And sadly, these are often ignored or suppressed in the school environment, but they can be attended to when children have the freedom to really listen and attune to themselves and their bodies. So SDE recognizes that education is not just about the intellect, about academics, or skills that can translate into income or that will look good on a college application. It's really about preparing them to be whole and healthy people. Um, so we can resist the capitalistic pull, resist servitude and exploitation by really prioritizing things in our life like slowness, play, joy, rest, curiosity, savoring. Um, and we can also reject the capitalistic norms that make most of us very unwell. Things like hustle culture, the rat race, climbing the corporate ladder, basing our worth on how much money we're making or our position in a company. Um, so children who are free to self-direct their own lives and learning really know that they have agency. And I believe that by raising up a generation of people who know their power and agency, we are really sowing the seeds of liberation and transformation in our cultures. My boys were 7 and 9 years old when we started this unschooling adventure. At that time, their bilingual school was shutting down. Um, the local Chinese school was not open to us as foreigners, so we couldn't send them there. International school was too far and too expensive for us. And traditional homeschooling, like school at home, felt really overwhelming. And so we had to decide together what educational path to take. I knew that whatever path that was, it couldn't be a paradigm that dishonored and dehumanized them as people. And so for us, unschooling really became that path and practice of decolonization, authenticity, well-being, and liberation. This is my family now, 7 years after we started Untigering and Unschooling, and we are back in the States. but we still live life outside the compulsory school system. And although it can be challenging at times to be countercultural, uh, I think all of us can honestly say that we love the life that we are building together outside of or resisting the oppressive systems as much as we can. So for some of you who may be new to this idea of SDE and unschooling, this may be very uncharted territory and new and scary, but I really want to invite you to explore the world and possibilities of self-directed education and see how it can be a decolonizing practice for you. So that's all I have prepared, but I'm sure many of you have questions. So yeah, I'll turn it back over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Iris. That was absolutely lovely. I wrote down as you were talking, like you paint such a beautiful picture of how not just school and education could be, but just life in general. Like it just feels every what you said feels so important in terms of like a life that's relaxed and happy and where we're all allowed to be ourselves. And I mean, how many teenagers are there out there that spend, their teenage years trying to find themselves and, discovering who they are and really struggling in that in a society or an education, a school where they can't do that. Um, so yeah, just beautiful. Such a lovely, wonderful talk, Iris. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you. And just hearing like the reality of how much school defines a child's life. So it's not just school. When you think about school, it really defines their whole life and their existence at that age where it defines their sleep schedule, when they eat, their social circles,
yeah,
all of it. And so um, to be able to create a life outside of that system where you really feel like you have agency in your life is really mind-blowing. And I think the more I practice this, the more I realize how much power and agency we really have that we don't think we have
yeah.
because yeah. So
It's amazing. It's so true. And I do, I constantly find myself butting up against that. Like the whole, you know, I feel like I don't have control. And like I said at the beginning, the more I work in this space, the more I realize I have to make it the control out of what society has given us, which sometimes feels like we don't have much control. It was beautiful, really lovely. Thank you so much, Iris. So now I do love to I mean I'd love to ask you a few questions about yourself, and so we can find out a little bit more about you. Um,
sure.
those in the audience, if you have any questions for Iris, please do pop them in the chat. We've got a little while to do some Q&A, so anything that crops up, pop them in the chat. I will pick out some questions as they come in. So yeah, please do type in what you're interested to know. But first of all, I've got a couple of questions for you. So um, you talked about your childhood growing up and the fact that you were tiger pet, or I loved tiger cubbed. I loved it. I love that term. Um, and that's kind of all you knew, and that was sort of so obviously you brought that into your own parenting. What do you think your childhood would have looked like if you'd gone on that unschooling journey when you were younger?
Hmm. I mean, I think so much of my personality was probably shaped by being in school. I became like very much, well, part of it is maybe my nature, but I was like very much a rule follower, a perfectionist. I wanted to be right. I wanted to do things well. Um, and I feel like a lot of the things that I did, the learning that I did was in many ways performative. in that I was doing it for the affirmation and for the attention,
Mhm.
not necessarily for a great love of it. And I wonder how much I would have really loved learning. And I'm rediscovering it now, now that
Yeah.
I'm not like, I don't have a carrot hung in front of me to like go read a book or whatever. Um, but I feel like I lost a lot of that, a lot of intrinsic motivation where I feel, and sometimes I need a lot of external structure and a lot of extrinsic motivation to get things done sometimes.
Yeah, me
And
too.
that's that's part of my school conditioning, I feel,
Mm.
and something that I am unlearning and needing to um, reclaim and heal, like I remember after I graduated from school, and there was no clear path forward anymore. It's like
Mm.
it was like, oh, grade school, then junior high, then high school, then college, and then maybe higher education. But then after that, like, what do you do with your life? And I felt like I was off the rails. I had nobody telling me what to do anymore, and I didn't know what to do with my life. I felt very lost. Um, And I just wonder if from a young age we have that sense of knowing ourselves, our sense of really, this is what I like to do. This is how I want to live my life. These are the values that are important to me. If I had the freedom to do that, just how much more connected to myself I would be.
Mm. I so empathize with that actually, Iris. In my schooling, I went through doing the things I was good at, so I completely, yeah, I was on the same path there, and the things that I got good grades at. And I remember at one point kicking myself when I was at university because I picked a course that I wasn't very good at, and I didn't get very good grades. And I was like, oh, I should have picked the course where I knew I'd got good grades. But looking back on that now, like, why? Why would I want to have picked the one just for the grades? Like, I should be picking stuff that I want to learn, right? So completely, yeah, completely empathize with that. Um, how did your two boys respond when you started changing the way that you parented them and then also schooled them as well?
Yeah, I may have selective memory. I don't know. But I feel like my children were very responsive. I think they were so thirsty to be treated respectfully that when I learned how to like empathize more with them, they were very responsive and I very quickly noticed a change in especially my oldest son where in the past when he would have meltdowns or act out, I would be very punitive and angry, send him to his room, punish him with like, threatening that I take away his toys and stuff like that. But when I responded with a lot more empathy, with trying to understand his needs underneath all of that behavior, um, he softened very quickly, I feel.
Mm.
And that was just a cue to me. I think I needed that because I was going through such like an extreme change that I needed maybe some evidence, some proof that this was going to work and this was the right way. And I did fairly quickly see that, oh, this is the way our human hearts are designed to be, to respond to um, like we need validation, we need to be heard, we need empathy, we need compassion, we need patience, all of that. And so when I was able to provide more of that to him, particularly my oldest, he was very responsive. I think in terms of the unschooling, uh they loved it. I think it's like the child's natural state. They
Mm.
hadn't been in school that long. My youngest, we left after his first grade year. So they hadn't been in school that long. And so I feel like they bounce back to their natural state of childlike curiosity and playfulness pretty quickly. It was me that had a hard time
Yeah.
when they were playing as children do and not getting down to the business of learning in the ways that I had categorized learning. And so a lot of it for me was unpacking my beliefs about what learning really was. Like,
Mm-hmm.
as adults, we are constantly learning, hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not necessarily doing it in a school setting. We as humans are designed to learn, to continually engage with our world and gain more information to help us live like with more ease and joy and whatever in the world. And so when we trust that natural instinct in our children, that's when we can like rest in it a little bit more. But in the beginning, and even sometimes now, it can be really hard because we have these certain views about what learning looks like. And we really need to unpack those myths because
Mm.
learning is happening all the time in every situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's all the harder when when the society that the learning that is available to people in the society is set up in a certain way, isn't it? So you're sort of pushed through that progress, but it can happen in so many different ways. Amazing. Okay, I've got a couple of great questions coming through in the chat, Iris. So I'm going to pick a
Awesome.
few out. Um,
Sure.
so Amy asks, what is the adult's role in scaffolding unschooling? Or how did you do that?
Um, I think this is once again one of those things where it's not a one size fits all. I think it really depends on your child and what they um, invite into their lives. I think again that it's done in a respectful, consensual way where we're trusting them and also trusting that they'll probably make mistakes and that's okay. I think sometimes the scaffolding that we do is for our own benefit rather than for the child's, where it's like we want to make sure you don't make this mistake, or we want to like set you up for this type of thing that we want you to do. When maybe the child isn't ready for it, maybe they want to take a different path. And so I think there needs to be a lot of conversation about what kind of supports they need. Um, and also sometimes, like, again, this really depends on the type of support your child needs. Um, but sometimes we um, scaffold too much so that they learn helplessness, if that makes sense. Sometimes a lot of the things like we need to do less so
Yeah.
that they can learn. That they learn by doing. They learn
Mm.
by doing, they learn by failing. Of course, if they're asking for help, if they're inviting it, we step in, we help, and we support. But we really have to be careful about not doing it in a power over way. Does that
Mm.
make sense?
Yeah, yeah, perfectly. And actually, it really makes me think of the fact that that happens so much in school. Like, I definitely noticed with my daughter in primary school that it felt like she became more helpless as she got a
Mm.
bit older because she used to go out and we'd always find her doing all sorts of things that probably, she shouldn't be doing at her age or whatever. But I remember once coming down, she was 7 years old and she had a friend over to stay. And I remember hearing noises in the kitchen and they decided they were going to go and make pancakes. And I was like, but you're going to school today. How is this going to work? But, and then I don't know, as she got older, I felt like because school always forced that, we'll do everything for you and, you have to do things this way, it kind of took that away from her a little bit, maybe. But yeah, I'm constantly trying and catch myself when in fact, My daughter's catching me now. She's 11 now, but she keeps when I try and help her with something, she's like, "Mum, get off. I can do it myself now."
No, I truly feel because like my instinct is a tiger mom instinct. So my
Yeah.
instinct is to micromanage and control. And so I have to step away a lot of the time. I have to leave the room. I have to go out of the kitchen when they're cooking. I have to like try to stay out of it and stay unattached because sometimes our involvement is um it puts pressure on them because they know we're watching them. They may know that we're expecting them to do it a certain way, like we and they are less free to play, to experiment, to really get their hands dirty in it. And so I feel like a lot of the times we need to stay out of it and let them get into it without
Mm-hmm.
expectation of any sort of result,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that's part of it too when we're trying to scaffold and support in some ways. Again, it depends on the context, but sometimes it's because we still want a certain result.
Mm-hmm.
And what if we could release some of those expectations and let them experiment and figure it out?
Yeah, amazing. Of course, yeah. I love it. Okay. So Annie in the chat says, how do you help your children with learning how to cope and handle when they encounter systems that aren't democratic and don't advocate for self-agency? Because sadly, we do have to face these in life.
Mm, I, yeah, I mean, probably most of the systems that we have in our world are less democratic than we would hope. I think it's to go in with a lot of awareness and consciousness because I think when we're sort of just part of a system, we're like the fish in the water and we don't know that we're in the fishbowl. We don't know that we're in the water. So part of it is like being able to see from the outside, like, okay, I am making the choice to become a part of this system, but I know what it is. And
Mm,
so I will use it in ways that serve me, and I will reject the ways that it won't. And so I feel like really teaching our children to be fully aware of their own power and agency and their right to a choice. Like you can choose this, but you can also choose not to be a part of it.
mm,
That is always,
mm,
well, maybe not always, but
mm,
that is a choice. And when you choose to be a part of it, that there may be consequences. Are you willing to accept those consequences of being a part of that because of the benefit that you'll gain out of that system?
mm,
And so always asking our children about that. So for example, like we don't do grades and I don't evaluate my child's work, but now he is taking classes at the community college. And so he's going to get graded. He's going to get feedback, but it's because it was self-chosen. It was something that was initiated by him where he wanted to take this class. He wanted to improve his skills in this way. He wanted to get feedback from his professor. Um, so in that way, he is aware of what he's opting into.
mm. Yeah, yeah, that's really it makes me think of particularly like going, as you say, taking classes, going to university, or even choosing to go into the world of work, where
Yeah.
suddenly you might be working for an employer who has certain restrictions, certain ways they need things doing. And as you say, that's fine as long as you know that that's what's happening and it's not like going unseen, I suppose.
Mhm.
You can make that choice. Mm,
Hmm. Yeah, and even for children who choose to go into the school system, like not just a community college, but back into like a public schooling system, I think it can be done with their eyes wide open, and knowing like, oh, the social engagement they get there, or the extracurriculars, or the ability to have access to like a bunch of different adults and a bunch of different other peers. Like the value they get out of that is worth what they might have to suffer.
Hmm.
And they get to choose that. That
Yeah,
is decision that they um, can choose for themselves. It can feel very despairing and helpless when you don't feel like you have that choice. I think that is the big issue with many children who may push back against it.
mm,
Um, but when you do feel like you have the choice, you can choose to leave if
yeah,
that's going to be your choice. And so, um, always giving that as an option as well to our children.
that's where they get their agency.
Mhm.
Okay, Debbie asks in the chat, how do we help um, our children? So if they, for the things, the skills they need to learn is what she's saying. So if a child avoids reading, as an example, and we know that at some point in their life they are going to need to learn to read, how do we accommodate that if we are approaching things in an unschooling way?
Yeah, yeah. Um, Again, I think it's like my question would be like, why are they avoiding reading? Like, is it because they're just not interested? Is it because they feel like they're not good at it? Is it because they have a learning disability? So there's all these different ways that we can approach it in a supportive way rather than a you need to meet this standard and having a lot of fear around it. Because again, like there's a lot of unschoolers who don't read until they're like 8 or 9 or much older. And if they are still able to navigate around the world the way they want to without being able to read, then there can be a lot of like freedom around that. But when there's fear, like
Mm,
they're never going to read, then I think they may sense some of that anxiety. Maybe they're resistant to it because of our reaction to it and feeling maybe coerced or that there's something wrong with them. So we really have to be just very mindful of what's going on within us when our
mhm.
child
Yeah.
isn't reading. And then, um, yeah, I don't know, like most of our societies are a very literate centric world, and it's not something that they can avoid.
Mm,
So finding ways to um, engage them with it in ways that are like fun and uh, connected to their interests. Like I know a lot of kids who learn how to read because of like their love of Minecraft
yeah.
and like different things like that, right? Where what is the thing that they love and they will find a way to engage with reading or
Mm,
literacy and word recognition and all of that through their interests. So,
mm. I love how you brought it back to because it always seems to come back to this somehow. Is like if you're struggling with something with your children, what's going on for you? Like what is it that's in you that's making you feel like that's urgent or important or yeah, it's really interesting. That's a question that I think we need to come back to more and more. Um,
and also, yeah, also like um, embracing other ways of gaining information, right? I think in a
mm,
school-centric world that is very based on words and stuff like that, it can be ableist in that it's like everybody needs to learn a certain way or gain information a certain way. Whereas I feel like nowadays there's a lot more access to
mm,
knowledge through different mediums.
yeah.
And so validating that as a way to gain information as well.
Yeah.
Of course, yeah, like not to just ignore reading or whatever, but that there's like many different ways to gain information and to learn new skills.
I think it comes back again to the way that we have set up schools, because of course in a school you're going to struggle really early on um, to do anything within the classroom if you can't read, because so much of how we teach in schools is around reading and writing, which is one of the reasons we teach it so young. But of course, as you say, like in a in a setting outside of school, or possibly in an alternative school, progressive school, where you're looking at something that is, gaining knowledge in whatever way suits you, through conversation, through video, through audio, whatever. Um, yeah, it sort of opens the world up to other ways of learning, and for as long as you like, really. It's really
Mhm. Yeah,
good.
I know a lot of adults who don't spend a lot of time reading.
Yeah, yeah,
Like it's like love audiobooks or they're watching
yeah.
videos or whatever. And so again, to like have this conformist way of learning, um, yeah, maybe that needs to be challenged a little bit. But again, I haven't totally thought this through. I still believe that learning to read is valuable and that
Yeah,
is a skill.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
One's
but
gonna
how maybe to just
amongst them.
continue to expand
Yeah.
our ideas about what learning is.
Hmm. Yeah. I love it. Okay. Marie Jose says, and this is a sort of a more personal one, I suppose. How did you have time for yourself and your children? Um, did you have a job outside the home? And how did you sort of combine all of these parts of your life, where you were, a mum, a partner, you did your blog and all the other bits? Like, how did you fit it all in?
Yeah, I actually found that because we were unschooling, we could each really attune to ourselves and have a lot of time to do the things that we love to do.
Mhm.
So I think sometimes when people think about homeschooling, and originally when I was imagining like schooling at home, that model, that is a highly intensive, parent-centric model
Mm.
where there's so much prep, there's so much work. I like thinking about that model was like, I don't know how I can do it. The way that unschooling is different is that it's not centered around the parent. It's really centered around the child. And so a lot of it is providing space, resources, teachers if needed, support, all of that, so that they can do their own learning. And a lot of the times, like, that doesn't involve a lot for me, if that makes sense. Um, uh, it was just really creating space and providing access for them to have the tools to get what they needed. Of course, when they're younger, that's different. It's probably more hands-on when they're younger. But as they grew, they were just doing their own thing, and I was able to do my own thing. It's a very, yeah, I think there is again the assumption that if you're uh, a stay-at-home mom and you're home educating in this way that you won't have any time for yourself. I haven't found that to be true. I come into this room and I close the door and I'm able to do work and I let them know like, oh, I have a conference call or whatever at this time. And yeah, they are, of course, they're older now, so they're more independent. But even as they were younger, a lot of it was really just about creating space, time, and resources for them to
Mm.
engage in their own learning rather than me sitting down and teaching them a lesson. That's not really what it looked like for us.
Mm. I think I echo that in the way that my daughter is. And in fact, most of the time, if I tried to sit my daughter down and give her a lesson, she would just be walking out the door. She's just like, no, I want to do it my own way. So um, yeah, that's really interesting. Um, okay, so, oh, this is an interesting question, Iris. So Jiraj asks, what would you say was your biggest mistake? And what was the biggest surprise when you went down the self-directed education path?
Biggest mistake. Um, I don't know if I see mistakes as bad. I think that's part of like the deschooling, because all of it's like an experiment, right? All of it's a mess. Like you're just fumbling along and as you're trying to figure it out. I know in the beginning, when we were first trying out unschooling, I couldn't let go of everything. Like I was like, they still need to learn math. Like, how are they going to learn math if I don't sit down and like give them a worksheet? And so we still did math. We still like had the worksheets. And then I don't know how long that lasted. Not very long because there were a lot of tears and um uh and then I just realized it w wasn't consistent with my values and with what I was with what I believed. It
Mm,
was a lot of fear, a lot of like um but in the end, I had to let go of that too and work through my own fears regarding that. Um, but do I see that as a mistake? Like to me, that was just like part of my process. And
mm,
and so I think like for those who want to explore this option, there are no mistakes. There is only process and practice and you figure things out as you go. And the beautiful thing, because there is no standard, because nobody is telling you what to do, is you can pivot at any time. You can
mm,
make changes at any time, and you can be responding to the needs of yourself and your family at any time. So in the middle of this, we had an international move from China to back to the United States. And so things needed to look different during that time. We didn't know what it was going to be like when we came back to the United States. And so we were adjusting. We were just like playing it by ear. We were seeing how we all felt. And um, yeah, the beautiful thing about unschooling was that we had the freedom to do that. We had the freedom to be on our own schedule, um, just meeting the current needs of our time. And this also through COVID, right? When
mm,
everything blew up and like all of the routines and systems that you had in place, like all of that went out the door. And so like how can we be responsive to the situation at hand to seek like what is going to work for us in the reality of this moment.
mm.
What was the
Okay.
second question? I forgot.
Oh, yes, sorry. The second part was what was the biggest surprise on your path, your self-directed
Yes.
education path?
Yeah, I think again, like it didn't just become an educational, it wasn't just about education for us after a while. It was
Mm,
again because like learning to live outside a system that everybody assumes is the way it has to be was so empowering in a way because we left that system and we realized we're surviving. And not only are we surviving, we are doing great. And so this fear of not having that safety net of that system began to really help us to unravel all these other quote unquote truths that we thought were just
mm,
absolute truths. And then like gave us just really empowered us to say like, that might not be true, or I might not need that, or
yeah.
I don't have to do that. So I think it really, at least for me, helped unravel all of that so that I could really live more authentically rather than being controlled by all these outside voices and systems.
Mm. Oh my goodness. It makes it the word it makes me think of is freedom. Like that the choice to be you and to live your life exactly how you want to live it, rather than this kind of as you say, like other people making choices for you.
Mm,
Um
yeah.
oh, it gives me a swell in my heart. Um okay, so Fiona asks, where would be a good place to start? It seems quite overwhelming. Um, I'm assuming, if you're currently in a sort of mainstream school environment and everything is controlled, and as a parent, as you say, like you've been brought up as a tiger cub and this is all you know, where do you start? She says perhaps facilitating an environment full of enriching potential experiences. But what would some examples of an enriched environment be based on your experience?
Mm, I think I feel like that is again a parental schoolish concept of enriched environment where we feel like they need a lot of bells and whistles in order to learn. And I don't think that's necessarily true. You don't need a lot of money. You don't need a lot of fancy classes and all of that. Like, whatever situation you are in, there is learning to be done.
Mhm.
And so um, I think definitely having access, this is something that the Alliance for Self-Directed Education, and they say on their website too, is like access to the tools of the culture. So what are tools of the culture and age appropriate as well, right? Like you don't want to be having like giving a young child things that are too complex. So you want to have age appropriate uh, playthings and tools. But sometimes like the kids just like to play with pots and pans or with like takeout containers, right? You you don't need something too fancy. Um, so I know that there's a lot of fear around screens and stuff like that. I am a fairly screen positive neutral type of person. And so like for us, especially as teenagers, like having access to those tools of the culture, which are very important in like our current modern culture to access learning and information and different perspectives. So
Mm.
I think nature, getting out in nature, being in community with others, all of those are ways to enrich your environment. But again, this is very individualized and dependent on what your child is interested in.
Mm.
And so if they are really into music, how to create more access and opportunity to others who enjoy the same things or musical instruments and something like that. So it's like again, it takes some experimentation. It takes um playing around with it, but it doesn't need to, I think again to like wait and hold back on what the child is bringing up instead of, oh, there's this fun like baby Einstein thing or whatever, and then placing that and trying to enrich the child's environment that way, if that makes sense. Like really spending time observing, knowing your child, taking cues from your child, and then
Mhm.
building upon what their propensities are rather than just like trying to do everything.
Yeah. Start with them and listen to them. That makes so much sense.
Mm.
Okay, we're coming towards the end of the session, so I've just got one final question for you, Iris, which is, what would be your greatest wish for young people and parents for the future?
Yeah, I think what you were saying in terms of being free. I
Mm,
think that is the world that we want to live in, the world that we want our children to inherit, is a world that they can be whole and free. And what does that look like? And how can we educate towards that reality? So much of schooling is about educating towards the current reality that is killing us, that is destroying our planet, that is so like unhealthy, but we're still trying to educate to fit that system. What if we educated and learned to live and exist in a radically different world so that we can help build that new world? I
mm.
think that is my dream, like how not to assimilate, acculturate, condition ourselves to um to just submit to a reality that none of us want, but really to have the radical imagination to live into something new and something that is really aligned with what we want for ourselves in the world.
Oh, it's so beautifully put. And you speak so well, Iris. It's been absolutely a pleasure to have you here this evening or this afternoon for you in the US. So thank you so much for coming along and giving us your wisdom and your experience. Um, Thank you to everyone who has joined us as well. It's been really, really lovely. There's been loads of stuff going on in the chat, which I haven't been able to keep up with all of it, but I'm so glad that people are you're inspiring conversations in the chat. So that's really, really lovely. And as a thank you for those who have joined us live today, we actually have one person who is going to win a copy, a signed copy, I believe, of Iris's book, which is called Untigering: Peaceful Parenting for the Deconstructing Tiger Parent. So let me just find who the winner is. Chosen completely at random. We have the winner will be Nina Moon. So congratulations, Nina. You've joined us live. It's been really lovely to have you here and obviously everyone else. Nina, do get in touch with us. Send us an email at info@educationstartups.org, and we'll make sure we get your book to you. So congratulations. Um, Thank you everyone for coming along to this session. We are going to be launching into our networking session in a few moments. But just before that, just to give you some information, our next session is running, our next summit session will be running tomorrow. It's 12 p.m. GMT with Becky Carlson. So Becky is a classroom practitioner and founder of two professional educational online learning networks. So it'll be really great to hear from Becky from a classroom practitioner perspective. And I just want to thank you once again, Iris, for joining us today. It was absolutely lovely, and I really look forward to following your work further.
Thank you. Thank you for having this conversation. Really enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.